And then also I'm going to record it.
Mm-hmm.
How do I do that? Record on this
That's
computer.
wrong. It says recording. I see that.
Okay, great.
Yep. See you soon. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Black August Book Club. This has been, well, it still is. This is a 4-session series of conversations and discussion with the authors of Until We Are Free, this book, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada. This is the 4th of 4 weeks, and we're ending tonight with Towards Black and Indigenous Futures, a conversation. My name is Michelle Pearson Clark. I'm a visual artist, I'm a writer, I'm an educator. And to situate myself, I'm born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago, which is traditional territory of many Amerindian tribes, something that I've enjoyed seeing awareness and conversation in more recent years to think about the Indigenous people of that territory. My ancestors hail from the west coast of Africa, as far as I know, from India, and then more immediately in the Caribbean, Antigua, Barbados, Dominica. I always have to say I'm the daughter of Eulalie Francella Charles. It very much defines how I move through the world. And wherever you're joining us from tonight, I really invite you to reflect in particular tonight on the land that you are on, how your people got there, who the traditional keepers of the land are, what the treaty relationship is, or if it's unceded territory. I'm hosting this conversation from the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. This evening, I'm so thrilled to be in conversation. You know, everybody's just like a name in this book, and then like I get to see your faces and meet you and be in conversation. It's been wonderful. So tonight I'm going to be in conversation with Raven Davis, Giselle Diaz, Leanne Betta Samoke Simpson, and Cyrus Marcus Ware is on another important meeting, but he will join us at around 7:30. So please introduce yourself to the peoples. Leanne, you want to start?
Sure. Ani Kinewaya, my name is Leanne Vitasimusak Simpson. I am a writer and an educator and an academic and a musician. I'm a Chisagi Anishinaabe and a member of Alderville First Nation, and I'm coming to you from Peterborough or Nagojawani in Ontario. So I'm so happy to be a part of this. I wrote a piece for the book with Robin Maynard, and we were in conversation with, I was in conversation with her and have been in conversation with her since about Black and Indigenous futures. So I'm really excited to be here with Raven and Giselle and Michelle.
Welcome. Giselle?
Ni Nagani Josko Gijugo Kwe Indishnakas. My name is Giselle. I am Métis from the Red River, although I always say that my ancestors traveled the globe. So my ancestors traveled over from, on my father's side, from India and from the Seychelles Islands. My father was born in Kenya and moved over to Europe and then over to Canada, and met my mother, who was Métis from the Cree and Anishinaabe people. So I say that my roots travel and across lands and seas and oceans to ensure my presence in the world. So I am, what would I say about myself? I have been an activist and organizer around anti-prison penal abolition and transformative justice for the last 25 years. I am currently living with a roommate here. His name's Gabe. He's a little puppy, so I've got my eye on him. And I'm really happy to be here. I feel really excited about the conversations we're about to have. And I'm currently doing a PhD in the Indigenous field of study at Laurier, and also work for the Center for Indigeology, which offers holistic professional development. So miigwech for having me.
Welcome. Raven and Lily?
Hi, bonjour. Ani Nindishnakas Mishke Kenodan Kwe, Makododem, Pine Creek, Manitoba, Nindishnaba. My English name is Raven Davis. This is my incredible wife, Lily, my partner, who I've invited here. We are both all types of stuff for myself. I'm a multidisciplinary artist, a parent of 3 sons. I'm also an educator. I'm a medicine knowledge practitioner. And yeah, just, focusing on my art, focusing on collaborations that are meaningful, have been in the discussions around Black and Indigenous solidarity and abolition since a very young age, in the early 90s. I had really great opportunities to work with both communities in a really, really transformative and radical way. Specifically with Dudley Laws and Charles Roach in the Black Action Defense Committee. I witnessed Andrea Christian in the Center for Indigenous Sovereignty back in the early 90s, and what an incredible powerhouse she is. Just great admirer. Roberta Jameson, Kathy Jameson, her daughter. I have so many matriarchs that I've looked up to over the years, and knowledge holders that have taught me a great deal when it comes to transformative justice and what solidarity looks like. And so just really happy to be here today in the conversation with all of you. Very, very honored, very blessed to be in your presence. And yeah, I'd just like to introduce Lily.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you for inviting me here. I didn't just get invited because I'm the wife partner, but because we are also artist collaborators. Yeah. My name is Lily Oluwatoyosi Echo Davis. I'm originally from Manitoba, Winnipeg, but my roots lie in, I share a cultural background with you, Michelle, as I was raised by a Trinidadian father, but my father, who gave way to my creation, is Nigerian and Yoruba. So in me is mixed of all of the things. My mother's side is French, and I always say I'm just like we all are in this world, doing this dance between colonized and colonizer. Yeah, I'm just grateful to be here and to be able to share a piece with you this evening and to be present to your brilliance.
I really love hearing people talk about like their ancestors. And I don't know if you saw the meme that was going around this week that had like a chart, and it was like, for you to be here, you have to have 2 parents, 4 grandparents. And it was this sort of logarithmic thing that ended up with like 12,000 people, and it was just like seeing those figures charted out like that in a number of, like not that many generations, yeah, it's a really kind of beautiful way of thinking about that. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, Michelle, I just want to add to that, like part of our work and our relationship and our love is Black and Indigenous solidarity, which is why Raven invited me here, is because we've been working in that way, in that context.
Absolutely.
For the last 2 years. And we're currently in, oh my gosh, can you say
Mi'kmaq territory.
Kipuktuk.
Yes,
For
unceded Mi'kmaq territory, and yeah, very part of the Wabanagi Confederacy, and yeah, very, very, very honored to be in this territory with my relations. I consider my relations in raising children, and yeah, and in partnership.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. It's why I reached out to have you join us, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But just to get us going, I'll speak for myself and say that thinking about and learning about Black and Indigenous solidarity is still fairly new, and the approach to this whole book club has been a place to learn. That the book is a tool and a gift for us to learn. So much of what I read, I already knew in my bones, but then there's language and a framework where you come to know it in a different kind of way. So much of what I read I had no idea about, and it was all just knowledge. And as someone who's an immigrant, I've benefited from settler colonialism, and thinking about my place in this space and what what is common in terms of where I come from and this place and relations. And so this is just made sense for me as a place to end here, and also as a place to look forward. I think for a book that talks about so many difficult and painful things, the tone is very inspiring and comforting. And there's a lot of acknowledgement of difficult things, but also just look at all the amazing things that people are doing, and almost the last words in the book are, "We will win." And so I end this book club not as a place of closure, but as a place of looking forward, and to me, this Indigenous and Black solidarity is such a key way for us to move forward, So for those following along at home, our conversation is going to touch on chapters 3, 5, and 21. And in some ways, when I was reading through the book, this week is actually a response to you, Giselle, because in chapter 3, in your conversation with Cyrus, on page 51, you say, "I see strengthening connections between Black and Indigenous people through connection to the land and how we honor the land. I think it would be great to have really intentional conversations moving forward about how we want to work in solidarity." So this is one of those conversations, because I agree, I think it would be great. But before we get into conversation, as I said, I want to just mention an extra bit of gratitude to Raven and Lily. I was saying to Leanne and Giselle before we went live that, I had never, this is similar to some work I've done in the past, but obviously this was a new project. I wasn't sure how it was going to go online and Zoom. And so each week I've kind of learned what felt good, what felt right. And last week, for those of you who joined us, that we talked about performance, which is just at the core of my own individual artistic practice. And we did a kind of collective movement exercise with Rodney and Raven from Black Lives Matter Toronto. And it just was so good. It was just so good. And I just was vibing, as I woke up the next day and started to look ahead to week 4. And I thought, oh, I wish I had thought of this. It would be great to have a performance to start this week and to connect week 3 and to week 4. And I thought for a moment, the ethics of reaching out to an artist last minute is not something that I like to do, And then I thought, well, all I can do is ask. And so I reached out to Raven because I knew that their work probably meant that they had something that would be appropriate to share and wouldn't require too much extra labor to join us. And obviously I thought adding their voice to the conversation would also be helpful. So I'm very extra grateful for your yes and your response, and also that we were able to talk that through. And we had an interesting exchange where we acknowledged that, particularly as artists of color, we're all used to getting that last minute invitation where you feel like, this person said no, 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 and we're coming to you. Or, oh my God, diversity, we better reach out to somebody really quick, right? And we know that doesn't feel really good. So I appreciate your openness and generosity that we could be transparent about that between us. And that really you as well to particularly now in pandemic life where our capacities are reduced, our patience, our tolerance, everything. So an extra special gratitude to you. So I'm going to turn it over to you two to introduce and share your performance with us, and then we'll move into conversation after that.
Wonderful. Well, miigwech. And when you wrote me, Michelle, I mean, you probably could have just given me 24 hours and I would have said yes, just because I've been looking forward to this opportunity to work alongside you for so long. And then when I saw Giselle and Leanne were on here, and I was like, oh, someone totally declined. I know, totally declined. And there's no way. I totally had this awful self-sabotaging moment. And then I was like, I'm doing it. I got to do it. I look up to you, all of you so greatly, is that and this shared time is really wonderful. So, and you're absolutely right. Lily and I have been, I would say, close to 3 years that we've been in this process of performing together and creating work together and sharing each other's kind of artistic practices. And so when you asked me, we kind of already had conceptualized so many different things over the past few years. And so this was quite easy to pull together. The footage that you're about to see was shot last night. And it was last night's sunset. and the sound piece
Is
was
equally as fresh.
is
You
equally-
we love it. We love it.
it's fresh.
Yeah.
So
Just everything's fresh, you know. And
Yeah.
like the thing is that we talk so much. We've been in this conversation for so long, and we constantly have all this stuff that when are we going to do this, when are we going to do this? So the invitation really lit the fire for us to just create like some good support materials in a way, you know, and like content so that we can share this, and also start the work and continue it in a deeper way.
Wonderful.
Sure.
yeah, okay. So I guess I'll just introduce it first, and then we'll share the screen. So this collection of pieces is, there's a series of them, but this is one. This is actually the second one, the Freedom series, which was a photographic movement series that we did 3 years ago, at least. Was the first kind of like project in the series. This word is entitled Inatagawad, to understand in a certain way. And just considering like all the work Black and Indigenous communities have to do at the same time as trying to reclaim history, language, what happened here, what happened there. You know, we're gathering all this information at such high speeds. It's really hard to be able to completely process all of that information, especially if it's in academia or, you know, just the urgency to learn and to reclaim all this history. So this word is in Anishinaabemowin, and it means to understand in a certain way, to have a particular way of understanding something. And I think we need to harness that word and the beauty of it, because we're not just dealing with, you know, small beings here. You can quote me on that too. Quote me on the small beings. And, you know, it just takes a lot of energy. So, and without centralizing whiteness, is the other big key to this. So I'll read a little description that I sent Michelle yesterday or today. Without saying their names, without centering them, rejecting the misleading and poorly documented collective histories we share that is wedged land and water between us, that has pitted our relationships, feeding their agenda of supremacy and domination and resulting in harm and violence between us. How do we begin to prepare ourselves for these conversations? How do we prepare our bodies, the land, our food, our ceremonies, before we begin to even reclaim a discourse and think about our future? Taking the time that is rightfully ours to create spaces that nurture empathy and compassion, a system of care and accountability to one another. Harnessing what is required to physically embody the process of reconciliation between us that no longer centers them. Doing this work outside of academia and in community and on the land with our elders and knowledge holders. How do we nurture this mass amount of empathy we will need to hold each other's truth? I'm just gonna stop there and start sharing the screen. I just wanna give a land context to this. This footage was shot in a Black Nova Scotian community called Africville, and has a long history. If you don't know about it, know about it. The land has a lot of erasure and harm and violence that has been perpetrated to Black African Nova Scotians. And so this footage, you know, when Lily and I were talking about where we would perform, how would we begin to even talk about this really, besides what's in the history books, besides what's in citations, you know, like how do we prepare ourselves to even have this conversation, that we can come to the table responsibly? And that begins on the land. And so we actually live quite close to it, and we go down there oftentimes because the sunsets are just, it's the most beautiful place to watch a sunset. And it's just so moving to be on that land and be together on that land. And we have a lot of conversations about that. Did you want to share?
Just that also, like before it was Africville, it was Mi'kmaq land.
Yeah.
It still is. And that the Mi'kmaq were taken, displaced from that land, from those banks, from those same waters. And so it's already there. The context for Indigenous and Black histories and stories and coming together is all already there. So anything else?
No.
Okay.
Good. Yeah.
Let's do this.
Okay, sharing the screen.
Oh, that's not the right screen.
Uh-huh. Inatagawa.
We're just gonna pause because I don't think that it's actually sharing for the viewers.
Okay, let's go.
So I'm just gonna stop share.
Yeah, it worked before, but I'm just seeing blank white now.
Uh-huh. Yeah, we have the YouTube video pulled up, so we're just gonna try that one more time.
Let's try it one more time. So we'll say share screen.
Go to QuickTime Player.
I did that. And it just one moment while we troubleshoot. Thank you.
Oops, so strange.
Just 1 second. Hang tight. Sorry. I'm just trying to do that tech stuff. Okay, I'm gonna go back. Oh, there it is.
Okay, great.
Great.
Okay.
And I'm just gonna start it over.
Inatagawa. To understand in a certain way. To understand in a particular and revolutionary way. A deeper than decolonial way. Without centering coloniality. A land-based conversation with the earth, our futures, our responsibilities to each other, our collective agreements of how we will engage in meaningful, reciprocal, transformative relationships.
Centering the land. We talk about it, but rarely relate to it as part of our process. A quick Thanksgiving or land acknowledgement at the beginning of a gathering. But that's it. What was our relationship outside of colonial systems and violence? What is Earth like in the places we called home? Was it clay, rock? What is the mineral content? Is it high in copper, zinc? What does the groundwater taste like here? Is it a bit salty?
What medicines grow on this land? Did we use any of these for our baskets? Did we drink this medicine? How did it heal us? How do we recall these practices back into our life? To garner the strength to hold the complexity of our conversations, the experiences we share, and those we didn't. I want to feel the land and cleanse it from its history that no longer serves us.
Wash it away with the water we prayed with, were baptized in, celebrated, blessed and lifted up the Orishas and Oshan, protected our rivers, lakes, and oceans, acknowledging the earth and water as casualties of consumption, greed.
How do we relate to the earth during those times in our history when we were dehumanized? How do we continue to relate to the earth as we continue to be dehumanized by the governments, our healthcare, police, military, and in learning institutions? Inatagawat will teach us to hold our truths honorably and deepen the love and empathy. We will create movements, sound, that respond to both the loss of those deep-rooted, beautiful connections we had and celebrating the ones we are creating and nurturing now.
It will teach us how to grieve properly, how to grieve in a way that feels good for each of us, with a commitment to resolving lateral harm. It will teach us not to give up on each other, how to hold each other with care, to bring accountability, how to ask our community for the support we need, how to protect each other. It will hold and reflect our voices, trans voices, femme voices,
Two-spirit, indigenous, queer, disabled voices,
and interpretation, chronically ill voices, neurodivergent voices, deaf, mad, blind, and crypt voices.
It will fill the spaces that were previously distracted and held by dominance and supremacy. It will fuel us with new songs and dances and ceremonies, and remind us of our responsibility to the land and water and to each other.
Intawat will outlive us. We will transfer these bundles to our future kin. They will be our elders, our ancestors. We will unify and conquer the space that was wedged between us for close to 415 years.
Well, thanks so much for letting me share that, letting us share that with you. You know, super vulnerable. Those were all rough takes, and, you know, but like I said, it's something we've been kind of wanting to share with community and build, and it's just really fitting that you asked us to be part of it today. So, miigwech.
Thank you.
Thank you. The energy is just, yeah. Those who've been here for previous weeks know I cry very easily, so that may happen shortly, but we'll see where we get to. Thank you. That everything in your introduction, everything that you've shared in that performance, it just sort of encapsulates, you know, all of the issues. I mean, we can't talk about everything tonight, but it really just gives us such an overview and touches on so many of the questions and complexities that I would want to move into us grappling with tonight. So thank you. Whew, so just, I think maybe still take a deep breath together. Okay.
Woo!
but that's, you know, I mean, my work is about grief and loss, you know, and you mentioned grief, and I use gesture and performance a lot because there's just so many ways into these ideas, these issues. And I'm also simultaneously obsessed with language and the absence of language. So there's things that words and language gives us that nothing else does. And then there's things that language cannot give us, right? And we have to abandon language. We have those phrases like, I couldn't find the words, or, you know, and so I find performance, what you've gifted us tonight is just another way into what the words will now carry us through to the end. So, okay. I have a lot of tabs here. Let me find my place. So I already mentioned a question, Giselle, that was a prompt for me thinking about how to enter and what to touch on tonight. But the other question that framed this week for me is in chapter 5. So let me start by asking all of you the question that Lindsay Nixon asks Leanne and Robin on page 77. Why is it so urgent and necessary now for us to be thinking about Black and Indigenous futures and relationships? Oh, welcome, Cyrus. Hi.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Sure, my name is Cyrus Marcus Ware. I'm an artist, I'm a parent, I'm an activist with Black Lives Matter Toronto. I'm a longtime abolitionist, and I'm in Takaranto. I'm in the Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory, and I'm in the part of Takaranto that was underwater at the time of the Toronto Purchase and is unceded and is the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. So I'll just ask that question again to all of you to start us off. Lindsay Nixon, in her conversation, hosting the conversation between Leanne and Robin in the book on page 77. Why is it so urgent and necessary now for us to be thinking about Black and Indigenous futures and relationships?
I mean, a lot of my work and my research has been really inspired by the writing of Tiffany King, Dr. Tiffany King, and her writing about Black fungibility and this idea that Black bodies were used as interchangeably as seeds to literally terraform and change this land in order to displace Indigenous people and to make way for settler expansion. And that concept and that idea of how we were treated as fungible, you know, makes me think, okay, you know, there's a reason why, you know, Black and Indigenous communities have been pitted against each other in particular ways, have been in relation to each other in particular ways. And, you know, that the ways that colonial violence has played out has affected our communities in very particular and interrelated ways. And so to me, it seems like, you know, as we work to fight for abolition, you know, Giselle has always taught me that if we had Indigenous resurgence, we would have abolition necessarily, you know, as we work to fight for a world and a place where Black lives were considered inherently valuable, we would necessarily be making a world safer for all living beings on the planet. We would necessarily be making way for Indigenous resurgence. We would necessarily be returning land. We necessarily would be doing all of these things because there would be no Black liberation on stolen land, right? So we know that these are interconnected fights. These are interconnected and interrelated struggles, and that our liberations are bound up with each other. And so we have been in a 650-year-long relationship that was forced upon us because of colonialism. But what has grown out of it has been strong bonds and beautiful community and relationships, and, you know, an entire network of Afro-Indigenous people, you know, and a beautiful coming together that has the power to overthrow white supremacy on Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut. Like, we absolutely, working together, could overthrow the system because we are all of this place, you know, we are of this place, and the land here has been impactful to our particular communities in very specific ways because of the way that colonialism went on this continent. So to me, now is the time more than ever, right? Why wouldn't, you know, because we're in the revolution. So we're not going to fuck around anymore. We're not going to do the single issue politics. We're
That's
going
right.
to we're going to do this time the right way. We're going to do this one time, get it right, and we're not turning back. We're going to freedom. So it's going to take all of us, and it's going to necessarily mean Black and Indigenous solidarity.
Any other thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I thank you, Cyrus. Yes. I feel like it's urgent and necessary right now. I think, like, as somebody who identifies as Black, I really want to, like, the Black Lives Matter movement for me really represents like that, this embodiment of when anybody who is, and I don't like to say on the margins because I'm not on the margins here. I'm right here centered with you guys, right? So it's like when the Black Lives Matter movement for me really represents just, if once the needs of our community members get cared for, everyone gets handled. Like, it's not just about one type of person who is Black. It's about so much more than that. And it's urgent and necessary for me right now. It feels like these relationships, and that they're intentional, because as a Black person, like, I honestly, my culture is lifted up in so many ways. It has been usurped by all of like the nations all over the place. There's just like such a huge pressing for Black culture being always taken, but still my Indigenous community and counterparts, they don't have an Indigenous Beyonce. They don't have a lot of the different things that we already have in terms of just like being accepted. A lot of places, people still talk about Indigenous community like they're a legacy, like they're gone. And that doesn't work for me anymore, you know? So I want to be able to, like, the way that people will create space or don't create space for my Blackness, I also want to make sure that I'm bringing my Indigenous counterparts alongside with me, walking with me, so that we are seen together, moving alongside together. I don't know if I articulated that well, but I've thought about it a lot. I've never really said it out loud. It just feels so important that I'm able to take what I have and also bring, it's not okay for me to leave my Indigenous counterparts and community members behind at this point. Like, it just doesn't work. And there's a lot of support needed, a lot of support. Like, just the numbers, like From My Grandmother's Hands, that book, you know, it's just like 14 million Indigenous people were across Turtle Island before settlers, before colonization. Now it's 2 million. If that's not a genocide, I don't know what is. So I think it's important that we really understand like where our current Indigenous communities are really struggling and suffering in different ways and similar ways to our Black community, and continue to lift each other up. It feels urgent for me in that way. How about you, Ray?
Yeah, I mean, to sum that up, it's not about like, you know, competing or comparing histories as much as it is understanding the grasp of the impact in our communities and how that has trickled down. And it has been urgent. It was urgent before, it was urgent before me, it's urgent now, and it'll be urgent for our children. You know, it's gonna take a while to make the changes that are required. And we're winning, we're getting there, you know? But I'd be naive to think that it'll end in my lifetime. And because I've spent a lot of time with elders and their conversations and their, you know, experiences growing up, you know, in the 50s, 60s, even before that, you know, great grandparent stories, like lots of elders across all the territories that have shared stories about just, you know, how we've been pitted against each other in our communities, you know, and we have to really be gentle and take care of each other when we're having these conversations. And it does kind of start with not necessarily centering them, centering us, like looking at what is required to make these changes within us, between us, and in our communities.
Yeah, that word centering, it actually leads me right into my next question, because in the book, Leanne answers that question by saying on page 78, towards the bottom at the end of what her response to Lindsay was, she writes or says, during Idle No More, I was involved in a lot of conversations about allyship and about what tactics we should and should not use, about what strategies we should and should not use. I heard a lot of, we can't do that because we will lose the support of white people. Whiteness was so centered in our thinking towards solidarity. This moment that we're in right now offers brilliant alternatives to co-resistance without centering or bowing towards whiteness. So you've all kind of touched on it already, but when I read that, it just really makes it clear how white supremacy has worked to divide us. So how do we refuse this centering and become effective co-resistors? What does that actually look like? Oh, Leanne, you're on mute.
I think that Black Lives Matter Toronto has really embodied what that can look like over their organizing for the past several months, because I've felt Indigenous peoples and our issues have been that you've lifted them up and that you've made space, and that we're having these conversations in the book that have been instigated by Black Lives Matter Toronto to a much greater degree than happened during Idle No More. And I think that there's an urgency to that because of the viciousness of white supremacy, and because we're being eliminated, and the violence is so intense, but also because I think for me, I can't understand what's happened to my family and to my people here on the North Shore of Lake Ontario, unless I also understand transatlantic slavery and abolition and the system of anti-Blackness that white supremacy and capitalism and heteropatriarchy have entrenched. And so I feel like the land is important to both of our communities, because both of our communities are utterly dependent upon the land. And I really loved your performance, bringing those elements, bringing that water and the sunset into our conversation, because I think that's something that for me so often gets placed as a tension. But I think, in our culture, in Anishinaabe culture and in Métis culture, you're taught to share everything right from day one. And so, of course, we have to make space for Black self-determination and radical imaginings and futures and presence on these lands. Our lands are not an enclosure. They're not a nation state. There's something that we share. We share that home space. And so I really, really go back to a lot Cyrus's comment in the book where you say abolition, everything has to change. Like, we have to build this whole new world. This is an expansive project, and that's so generative for me. And I think when I look at the defund the police, all of the different, I don't know how many there are, 27 different points, every single one of those points also benefits Indigenous people. And that's a tremendous gift to our community. That's the revolution that Black Lives Matters is right now, is changing Indigenous lives. And that's that I feel like I'm going to tear it, because I don't feel like I've ever felt that kind of solidarity before. And I certainly have never felt that solidarity from white people.
Yeah, I'll just say I've been fortunate enough to have a love relationship with Cyrus for since almost the beginning of my organizing. So I've been so influenced by the work that you've done, Cyrus, and how you've informed my way of thinking, way of being, and being in relationship. So I think in the chapter where I talked about, like, when I heard you talking about revolution, I was like, oh, yes, of course, that's what abolition is. That's what we're moving towards. And it was so clear. And I think from that moment, it shifted the way I thought about abolition, but then also that as I grew into my teachings and as I grew into my identity and as I grew into learning and going inward for me of understanding how that relates to Indigenous, and I'll use your words, Leanne, radical resurgence, not just resurgence, but the centering of Two-Spirit queer people within the movement. So I think that it's also about being in right relationship. Like, it's just about being in good relationship and right relationship. And as Leanne said, a sharing relationship. So I think there was a song that I was taught by Marianne Cabiosi, and if I feel brave enough, maybe at the end I'll share it. It's called The Longest Road. And I don't know if some of you know it. She taught it to me as being that it was when Black people were walking towards the north, like to what was perceived as freedom, which it wasn't, but that Black and Indigenous people walked together. And for me, this is kind of an extension of that long walk together that we're doing into a time of change, like the hope that you talk about, Cyrus, that the bigness of what's possible. And Raven and Lily, what you brought in terms of like grounding us through the earth, through creation, is how I want to have these conversations in some ways, because I think that's in part what is missing, is that we talk about dispossession of land and the colonization of land in the discourses that we have, but we rarely talk about what is it that we're actually missing when we don't center the land as language, as identity, as culture, as ceremony. And I think that's what we need to be bringing into our movement. So I'm excited and feel really privileged to get to be at the beginning of some of these conversations for my journey. I know they've been happening for a while, but for me, it feels like an exciting time. So miigwech. Oh, and I just want to say also, like, the so many examples that Black Lives Matter have done in terms of showing up for the INAC, the Freedom School. Like, you've just given us so many examples of how Black and Indigenous people can work together to support movements. What's what, and like all the things that are happening. You just see that presence right now that is so important for us to be seen together and visible. So miigwech.
Michelle, I have such a memory impairment. Could you just say the question one more time?
Oh, it was just about how do we refuse the centering of whiteness and become effective co-resistors? Like, what does that actually look like? And I know, I mean, I don't want to like harp on things, but I feel like there's a lot of conversation about sort of ideas. And I know for people who are newer to some of these ideas, you cannot give people a manual, you cannot give people a checklist. But I think just trying to speak in kind of more concrete terms for people trying to understand things. And I mean, I'll speak for myself, like not just in the book, but you know, it's been fairly sort of, you know, in the last few years, like really taking the time to reflect on, you know, we keep kind of talking about being pitted against each other and tensions. I also feel a lot of sort of like caution around not wanting to cause harm and feeling like I need to educate myself more. But then really understanding that, you know, particularly before I came to this country, so much of what I believe was taught to me by white supremacy. Like, it sounds very basic and obvious, but that white supremacy has taught Black folks ideas about Indigenous folks and white supremacy, and the other way around as well, right? And so this notion of being pitted against each other, and that we really have to refuse what we've been taught to believe, right, about each other as almost a prerequisite to be able to move towards being in solidarity.
Yeah, and I think that one of our, you know, in the same way that as we work towards abolition, we're not just tearing down prison walls, we're building up the other thing that we want to grow instead. You know, I think that as we dismantle white supremacy, we're also building up or this garden of relationships, you know, and I think that working right now on love and connection and community building and supporting each other, you know, seems like the way to be planting the seeds for how we're going to live in right relations with each other. whatever that ends up needing to look like, in an Indigenous radical resurgence, whatever that would need to look like, how are we going to live with each other? And start to plant some beautiful ways of being with each other. I think that seems like a really important thing. I mean, right when COVID hit, we were just about to head to Wet'suwet'en because we were going to go and do some solidarity work. And right now we're working on a co-drafted letter from Wet'suwet'en and Black Lives Matter in support of the RSTs who were arrested during the monument artistic intervention earlier in the summer. So just the ways that we've been able to kind of continually show up for each other, I think, is part of this relationship building that will lead us into whatever this next world is going to look like. How are we going to want to be in relation to each other? So I feel like this is a very a beautiful time of relationship building, and I feel like this is an opportunity that we've been given because we're in the middle of a revolution to really just go all in and to take on the responsibility and accountability of doing the work that needs to happen in order to be in right relations. So learning about all of the things that have happened in your community and the ways that it has impacted on Indigenous communities, and learning about the ways that things have happened in your community have impacted on Black communities, and doing that solidarity work right now seems so essential because we're building love connections that are going to last us into our great-grandchildren's, futures. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that phrase, being in right relations. It's just, it's very powerful, it's very evocative, and it's something that, I really feel in my bones for sure. So Sandy's not here with us, but I just want to touch a bit on chapter 21, because talking about sort of concrete examples, her chapter is Indigenous and Black Solidarity in Practice, and she talks about BLMTO Tent City. And I really appreciated the ways that she works through both the logics of white supremacy that are relevant here. She cites the work of Andrea Smith, as well as adding her own theorizing to that. And so I just want to read a section from her chapter on page 302. Towards the middle, she says, "This partnership felt natural, but it is a partnership that must be intentional and continually renewed. Black communities can be anti-Indigenous, and Indigenous communities can be anti-Black. It is crucial for both our communities to resist the myths sold to us by the state, lest we end up tacitly supporting white supremacist logics. If Black communities buy into the logic of disappearance, white supremacist settler colonial logics are upheld within Blackness. If Indigenous communities buy into the logic of slaveability, white supremacist settler colonial logics are upheld within indigeneity. If either community buys into the one true history logic, we are tacitly supporting white supremacist settler colonial logics at the cost of erasing our own shared histories. Showing the power of Indigenous people as essential caretakers, lawmakers, and spiritual leaders in BLMTO Tent City was an anti-colonial and revolutionary act that rendered the settler colonial state as impermanent." So I just really appreciate the way here, that she talks about this needing to be intentional, continually renewed. She names the possibility that we can oppress each other. And I think these are things that sometimes it's difficult to address or acknowledge. And I just wondering your responses or thoughts of experiences of those difficult moments, of those tensions, of experiencing, anti-Blackness or experiencing anti-indigeneity. How do we respond? How do we cope? How do we deal? How do we move through those more difficult moments? Because solidarity is what we want, but we know it's not easy, right? So can we just talk a little bit about some of the difficultness and how you've dealt with moments like that, or just any reflections about some of those obstacles, barriers, difficulties?
I think for me, one of the things that helps is thinking of solidarity as a practice and an ongoing project that's about those love relationships. And so if I'm in a love relationship with somebody and something happens and we need to have a further conversation, there's a way of engaging in that kind of conversation that touches on what Sandy's talking about here, this idea that Indigenous people didn't learn these kinds of conversations in residential schools. The state education system in Canada has a vested interest in Indigenous peoples not knowing their history, and certainly not knowing Black history. And so we have these gaps. And I think when we are at each other's protests, supporting each other, when we have relationships, when we're in conversation with people, when you start to develop relationships of trust and respect and love, and those kinds of issues come up, then there's a conversation, and there can be, I'm sorry, there can be a taking of responsibility and an accounting, and then a moving on. I think sometimes a lot of harm happens when you don't have that relationship and you don't have that practice of solidarity at that base. And so sometimes I worry about these tensions that we're talking about, particularly on social media. You can see getting elevated very quickly, and the harm that they're causing our communities who aren't online. So I think a lot about the responsibilities that I have as an Indigenous educator to bring this book and this work to my students, and to have these conversations with my students and my family and my community, knowing that there has been this education gap, and knowing that if we're going to build a new world, then that education is part of it, right? Reading groups are part of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just agreeing with everything that you're saying, Leanne. For me, I mean, I have a lot of experience in Black and Indigenous relations, I think probably since high school. I grew up in the West End of Toronto and went to an incredible high school at Weston Road in Jane area. And just like a really strong Black community. And we had a Black student support group at our high school that was very welcoming, and there was only like 2 other Indigenous students that went to that school, so we didn't really have a committee or student center, but always just, come with us kind of thing, you're part of this history too, and was always super empathetic. And I think that empathy, it's beautiful to witness in young people. It's beautiful to witness in children. And I think it's greatly lacking in us as we, get older. Sometimes we we're triggered, our lives are at risk. we're on guard.
Mm.
And so it's really easy to not be able to see another person and to see how this supremacy is impacting us on deep core levels in our skin memories, in our bones, the hormones that are being released from being so anxious all the time, and slowing it down. And I think that, part of the piece that we're working on is like really getting in touch, like those medicines that are on the land of Africville, on Mi'kmaq land. Did we make tea with those medicines? Like, did we talk using those medicines together? Like, what teas did we make? How did we communicate, like, what was going on in our families and with the government? And, how do we do just the simplest stuff that brought us so much joy? And calling that back and calling in those small ways of really acknowledging the land as part of our process. It has to be included in the process of us reconciling our communities. And yeah, I mean, like I said, through the Black Action Defense Committee, through Red Sisters, Black Sisters Collective, which was a theater project, again, late 90s, maybe early 2000s, a lot of opportunities to work within, I mean, Toronto, which was very fortunate, work within communities, Black and Indigenous communities, you know, where our council fires were, where Anishinaabe Health was, where our dance clubs were, you know, Indigenous people were around. And yeah, there was some beautiful things happening. And yeah, I think we just got to recall some of that. We have to do the work to actually recall those memories, to remind ourselves that we've actually been doing this for a while, and we need to just continue holding that space, going slow, and taking the time to, yeah, come together. Yeah.
I went into prisons for a long time in the Ontario region. So where I would see that what prisons create in that deprivation, right? So there's a lack of resources, there's the deprivation, which can cause that pitting of Black and Indigenous people against one another. And since prisons are a microcosm of like society at large, it's an obvious place where that shows up. And it certainly showed up while I was doing that work in prison. Yeah, it's super complicated. Like, they're just not easy conversations to have, and yet I was committed to having them. And I think part of what Leanne said, I have Kathy Absalon King, who's both my advisor and a friend of mine, and she stood up in front of a bunch of educators at one time and said, you know, they were all graduating from Teachers College, and she asked them to raise their hand if they'd ever heard about residential schools. And maybe 4 people raised their hand, and she's like, you should be furious that you just put in, you know, $40,000 or $50,000 for an education, and you did not learn the history of Canada. And I think that can be said obviously for Black history of in Canada as well. Like, I'm 47, I didn't learn anything. I learned so many new things reading this book. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, we should be furious at this white supremacist system that keeps us uneducated around our histories and each other's histories, and what responsibility we have in continuing to do that work, and that commitment to do that work. And when I used to do it in prison, you would see a shift. Like, people would shift when they have information, often, not all the time. And prison's very, it was particularly difficult. I was going into federal prisons, sometimes with Psy for many years. We did that early 2000s. So yeah, they're just difficult conversations and uncomfortable conversations. And how do we live with complexity, and how do we live with discomfort and anger? Like, how do we do that and do it in a good way? So I think that's what I think about often, times when I was inside and would hear people speaking, and I'm like, oh, it's because you think somebody else is getting something you're not. In fact, none of you were getting anything, just to be clear. But it's just that deprivation makes us feel like, well, they're getting this. So, and that just plays into the anti-Black racism or, colonial thinking.
Yeah.
I think it's such an important thing that you said, Giselle, and like everyone has been sharing, like about the rage. I think like one of the difficult things about like in the obstacles and barriers is knowing where the rage should be directed. In decolonial work, we have to understand that the same walls that we built up to navigate white environments are not the same ones that we need to bring to our circles of connection and community. And that's been a big lesson for me right now, as I'm able to pick the spaces and places that I interact in with more intentionality than prior to COVID, is noticing the ways that people are inflicting colonial ways of being on me and vice versa. And that to me is a real barrier. You know, you hear the catchphrase like decolonize your mind over and over again, but what does that really mean? You know, I'm lucky enough to, for many years, have been being mentored on and off by Debbie Young, Anita Africa, and like this conversation around decoloniality, like where it starts right here and not just as a catchphrase. You know, I think it's important that we're making distinctions. When we say responsibility, are we saying responsibility as blame, or are we saying responsibility as a request for accountability? that we're able to make those distinctions, that we understand that folks in our community who are navigating different obstacles or different ways of existing in the world need different things. Like the disability justice movement has so much to teach us because it's asking us all to slow down. And when we do that, we can only make gains. So I think from that place, like when we're navigating those difficult moments, we really do have to consider ourselves, but also who, how. You know, I think transformative justice models are really great. I don't like to talk about restorative justice because I don't think there was anything good to restore to. You know, so I would love to see that language kind of disappear when it's not appropriate. So those are just a few of the things that I think about as related to obstacles and difficulties and barriers. You know, like what is our body holding? How do we navigate our own healing? How do we support the healing of each other?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, Cyrus and Giselle already take up abolitionist, you know, in a very broad way in their conversation in chapter 3. And you just mentioned the word, you know, decolonize, which I think for a lot of us is still a word that, like, it's thrown around like all over the place. What does it mean? You know, I think it's used to mean, I mean, I think it's one of those words when people say it, you cannot assume that the person you're saying it to or the person who's saying it to you is meaning the same thing that you.
That's right, exactly.
You know? And so, but just to go back to chapter 3, on page 36, Giselle, you're reflecting and you say at the bottom, and as Indigenous people continue or start to reclaim identities and teachings and participate in land-based ceremony, we are moving towards abolition. Understanding my identity has completely changed the way I thought about abolition. Instead of as a process of tearing down, which I think we need to do, and resisting, which I think we need to do, there's something underneath that, which is about the survival and resurgence of Indigenous people. So we've already heard that word resurgence a couple of times tonight. So I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit more about how you see decolonization and, you know, radical resurgence as abolitionists, and in what ways has your thinking changed with those concepts and those relationships that you allude to there?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because I actually had read it and I'm like, oh, people are talking about building. It's not that simple. Of course, we're talking about building as we're talking about tearing down, like that idea that transformative justice is the other side of abolition. I don't know if it's the other side because it's multidimensional, but yeah, I think that I've said it before, that coming into my identity has actually been the biggest contribution I've made to abolition, like for myself, like my internal journey of understanding who I am, my identity, the complicatedness of my identity of being, you know, from all over, that I'm not just Métis, I'm many things. And so that idea of being the settler, the colonized and the colonizer, the settled and the, so grappling with that, but also coming into my teachings have allowed me to see something different. Like it's a different worldview that I'm standing with and being with now, and being in relationship to other people with a different way of seeing the world. And I think that some things influence that. So my friend Oasis, who I organized with, and I talk about this in the book, we had done a Prisoners Justice Film Festival in London. And we'd done, you know, Cyrus and I had done it together in Toronto as well. But when I went, we'd always talked about prisons as being like, you know, land defense, you end up in prison. You know, there's Two-Spirit people end up in prison, queer people end up in prison. So we talked about ways that Indigenous people intersected with the prison industrial complex in very particular ways. Political prisoners, yeah. And I think what ended up happening is when she suggested that we show something on collecting wild rice or powwow dancing, my brain was just like, how is that abolition? And then I was like, oh yeah, reclamation, of course, is abolition. And as we stand into our center and who we are and into our nations more broadly, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to lead to abolition, because there has to be a analysis around anti-colonialism or decolonization. Like there has to be an analysis, because people in prison will talk about this as well, that they started understanding their culture and who they were and their identity when they went to prison. So And my first experience in a sweat lodge was in prison. So at 26, I went into a sweat lodge in the prison for women, or Grand Valley Institution. And it was the first time my mom came to me. My mom had died because of medical neglect in a hospital when I was 2. So I wasn't connected to my Indigenous ancestry through her, although my second mom was also Haudenosaunee, was Oneida and Scottish. But she came to me in the sweat lodge, and I'm like, how am I just coming into this knowledge and this identity and this understanding, and coming into my ancestors and meeting my mother in prison as a visitor, as somebody who's coming into this space. And then, like, in that particular moment, women talking about, like, not understanding the colonial context. You're just coming into you're learning about your culture and your nation, and maybe if you're, depending on where you are and what teachings you're getting. But I think about that a lot around when we move to radical resurgence and we start talking, like, there's so many things tied to it. So I feel like I could talk about this a long time, and I mix between either over explaining or not explaining enough. So
over explain.
Yeah, that there's teachings about being in right relationship, not with just each other, but with creation. And this is my conversation about land and how we introduce land into abolition, and how we start to understand what it means to introduce land into the conversation of abolition. So me coming into my identity was also me coming into ceremony, but also coming into relationship with creation. So last year I tore my Achilles tendon and ended up not being able to leave my house for a month. Like, the choice was to slow down to a point of stop and just be like, okay. And outside my window, I've got a big window, and outside my window was a spruce tree. And one of my elders had said, make friends with a tree for a year, watch them through the seasons, see what you can learn, be in relationship. And in that reflection and reading Leanne's work, there's also, like, we're always on the land. All of us are always on the land. And creating that relationship with the land, even if it's through a window. But coming to understand my roles and responsibilities, my understanding my gifts, I was just able to look at abolition from a different view. Like, it was just like a whole world shift where you're just like, oh, I've been doing it this way, and now I see something new. And I don't know what it means. Like, I don't know what that means. And that's part of the conversation that we're having now. And with this spruce tree, over this period of time and over a year that I've spent with them, is coming to see that the expansiveness of the prison industrial complex beyond, and you'll see it in Prison in 12 Landscapes by Brett Stories, like the expansiveness of it and how the tentacles kind of move all over the place, is that's moving over land. You know, the roads that attach it, the police stations, the children's services, the prisons themselves, the jails, detention centers, children's aid, like immigration detention, like, it's taking up a lot of land. So it's actually its own disaster that's taking up land that has taken up spaces of like, land loss is the biggest threat to Indigenous people. So it means not being able to necessarily do our ceremonies or hunting and gathering and being on the land, just to be on the land and be in relationship with the land. And so I think this has started to shift my idea of abolition, and how do we integrate the conversation of land beyond dispossession of land, and the disconnection of people in prison from land. Like, so we talk about, like, I visited a friend as he was dying in prison in 2015, and I was in the PF private family visit, and I could watch the birds coming and going from the little yard inside, 3 fences. I could see the birds coming and going, and the squirrels coming and going, and the chipmunks, and having those relationships. But realizing, my friend Pete had said at times when he was in solitary confinement, had no relationship with creation. He could see the sky through a little, place in the not even barbed wire, but it was like a cage on the outside. And what that does to our spirits when we're disconnected from the land in that way. So that was broad, and I didn't tighten it up at the end there, but I think these are all the parts of
book club. This is book club. It's like
to abolition that I'm thinking of, and the ways that I'm moving towards thinking about, like, that video that Raven and Lily, you showed at the beginning, like, that coming up from creation, coming up from the earth, and our relationship to what lives on it, the language that we create, or that's created between that relationship. So how do we bring the conversation of the spirit of the land and our relationship to the land to these conversations of not just abolition, but all the movements we're working in. And when I saw, yeah, I could go on. I'll let other people talk. Miigwech.
Thank you.
I'm excited about this. Thank you.
When you were talking, Giselle, I was thinking about how in our culture, there's lots of Anishinaabe people here. We didn't have police, we didn't have prisons, we didn't have punishment, we didn't have hierarchy, we didn't have capitalism. We had more than 2 genders. I'm making it sound like a utopia. We have problems too, but there was like a lot of really good stuff. There was a diversity of sexual orientations. There was a diversity of relationship orientations. And so colonialism and all of this, the prisons and the police and that level of surveillance and that level of control is something that has come to us as part of colonialism. And so in Radical Resurgence, I became really interested in trying to figure out what those big foundational ethics and politics were that built that kind of a society. And so things like consent come up, things like respect, reciprocity, relationships, and this deep relationality, this deep attachment to land and to place and to belonging. And so I think when I'm thinking about Black and Indigenous futures and I'm thinking about world building, that's one of the places that I think I find inspiration, like you were talking about. But we're in a very complicated situation now with anti-Blackness, with a pandemic, with global warming and climate change. And so figuring out how to take some of those politics and ethics and practices and collectivize them and then build relationships with others, including the plants and the animals and the waters and our ancestors and those yet to be born, it becomes very complicated. But I think I share that inspiration and that generative quality of culture. And I feel really lucky to Raven started with our language. I think that's a source of knowledge and inspiration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned, Giselle, when you're talking about being in prison, deprivation, scarcity, and that's like such a key thing in this pitting. And what I really loved in the conversation between you and Cyrus as well is you, in many parts of that conversation, you discuss the importance of naming and honoring all the different ways in which we're contributing to abolition work, almost as a pushback to a scarcity, a not enough kind of like idea, right? That a lot of us in capitalism has done a good job on us, and a lot of us have to work almost on a daily basis because it's so internalized. And on page 54, you say, when I am manic, I'm busy. It fuels this productivity in a way that is such a colonial and capitalistic way of doing work. I had to be okay with myself by not doing it. There's a huge amount of personal work to just be okay with acknowledging that being in ceremony for me is a way of contributing to abolition. Being with the elders and learning my teachings is a way of contributing to abolition. Working on myself and burning my center fire is a way of me contributing. Being in relationship to others in a good way is a way of contributing to abolition. And just having to change my framework on some of those things to make it okay that I can focus on me, right? And thinking about tonight, we've mentioned, BLM Tent City, we've mentioned being at each other's protests, but I just think it's incredibly helpful to think about naming and honoring all the ways that Black and Indigenous folks can be in solidarity, right? That it's not just these big moments when I'm showing up for you at your protest, you're showing up for me at mine, particularly for our communities where we have to grapple with scarcity in all kinds of ways. So helping us understand here that we are enough, whatever kind of moment of relation is enough, and I'm just wondering, is that something that people feel in their daily lives? Is that something that's part of how you think about being in solidarity with each other?
Yeah, I think that having I have to go somewhere where my daughter's talking loudly. But I think that being in relationship with each other and building interpersonal relationships and building family relationships and teaching our children, about the things that they're not going to be learning through the education system, and building sort of networks of care seems like a way to go, right? Because it's like that idea of everyday abolition, that you get to abolition by living it in your everyday life, by reducing your reliance on calling the police, by reducing your reliance on carceral logics to solve your responses to crisis, conflict, and harm. Well, similarly, as we start to build, solidarity movements, we start to build it through the everyday things, through the everyday things, through the little things, and that's how you end up building strong connections. That's how you end up sitting in community with each other, and being in community with each other. So I think it's like a lot of minutia, that we know how to do, that are just part of what the beautiful nature of building a relationship, is that it goes through all of these phases. And that's a journey that we're on now. We're planting seeds, as we start to get to know each other. And so I think for people who are trying to find a way into this work, for people who have been maybe tuning in every week and trying to find a way into abolition, if you're trying to find a way into how to be in solidarity, between Black and Indigenous communities, if you're from these communities, so much of it is going to come through just the everyday, right? So, doing the work to make sure that you're connecting to other communities, so that you're able to know what's happening, and to be able to know, and get connected to people, and just start to be able to be in relationship and be in community together. That to me seems like a really beautiful thing. I mean, to me, so much of what I've been able to learn and grow and expand my brain, through conversations with Raven, through conversations with you, Giselle, have come through just having conversation, sitting outside on the stoop on a hot summer night, sitting in a park and talking shit and just trying to sort through what are we doing on this planet? What the hell is the point? And how are we going to change this? And what is the future? What does it hold? So much of that comes from just being together. And so to me, that's the work, right? Is like, the white supremacy and colonization has tried to make sure that our communities stay very distant from each other, has tried to make sure that our communities aren't in solidarity with each other, has tried to make sure that we, invisibilize Afro-Indigenous communities and Afro-Indigenous people. And we have to do everything in our power to say, absolutely not on our watch. No way. And we have to build relationships between our communities, one friendship at a time, one network at a time, one group at a time. And yeah, to me, that seems a way to do it, a way to start.
And bringing back our joy. I mean, Cyrus, you're my favorite game player.
Yeah.
We're together. We come up with these amazing games and we just like play them like we're 6 or 7 years old. And like white supremacy wants to take away our joy. It's just stripping us from our happiness and having that usefulness and in those connections. Yeah, and through music, through art, through prayer, through grieving, through collective grieving. What's happening now, like the times I light my center fire, but no devices anywhere, just holding that space for each other and what each other are going through when everything's shut off. What are we doing to be accountable to ourselves and what our integrity is and what we're saying? Are we living that? Are we being those people that we're talking about? And standing accountable, like when we screw up or make a mistake, and like having those conversations because they're going to happen, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say, but really, like, abolition and contribution, it's no mistake that the planet is in the state that it's in, and we have not also been getting what we need to live well and to be healthy and to be safe. It's no mistake that the environment is in the condition it is, as we're and we and our communities are still fighting this fight. This is not a mistake. This is part of the source of why things look this way. So I think everybody is so so wonderful to like say all of these things about how we can come back to the land, come back to our processes, how we engage with each other, like relational, like it's relational, you know. I can't keep powering through every single thing that is ever happening, including myself. It's no longer serving me. And we all have to ask that question, you know. I hope one day I can go to a university that feels good for me and get my PhD or do something like that. But for now, I'm getting my PhD in me. You know, I'm going to the University of Lili. Okay, so I really want to invite people to do that. You know, get your access where you can, and also knowing that like wherever we are is where we are, and make space for that. Because you know what, like there have been days even like I can't get up, whether it's body pain or mental or whatever I'm dealing with. I have to meet myself there. And if I can't meet myself there first, then how can I expect when something happens between us or out here in our community, how can I expect to meet you if I can't meet myself? So I just offer that.
So just to start bringing us to a close, there's so much I would love, you know, I try to limit these conversations because Zoom is taxing, right, for us in the audience. So, but there's a quote from Norbese Philip on page 80, where I think Robin is speaking, and she quotes Norbese when she says, "Make no mistake, if Black lives mattered or if Indigenous lives mattered, speaking to the two genocides at the heart of the unsettling of the Americas and the Caribbean, we would indeed be living in an altered universe." So what would that altered universe look like? What future are we working towards?
This is my favorite part. This is all I want to ever do. That's all I want to do is lie on the grass, you know, under the sun, lie on the deck under the stars, and imagine the future that we're trying to get to. It's going to be accessible. It's going to be rooted in disability justice. It's going to be Black and Indigenous led. It's going to be full of queer and trans people and two-spirit people. It's going to be our great grandparents' wildest dreams, you know? It's going to be the kind of world where our children's children will finally be born free from slavery and from that system of slavery and policing and carceral logics. It's going to be the kinds of future where we take care of each other, where we actually take care of each other, you know, in a responsible way, where we show up for each other. We make sure that everybody has not just what they need to survive, but what they need to thrive so that they're living their wildest dreams. You know, that the planet will have been healed because we'll have considered that to be so inherently valuable that living beings, including us, actually survive, you know? So we're going to have cooled the planet. We're going to have built a world that is rooted in social justice, where we have actual safety, where we have actually a sense of security, you know, where we know that justice comes from, you know, hard work, from liberatory work, from doing the difficult work with each other. That's how we're going to get a sense of justice with each other. We're going to build the most beautiful, glorious world. And what we've been told time and time again is that, shh, baby, it's not time to start thinking about that. But now is the time to start thinking about that. Now is the time to dream and paint and write and draw and create as much as we can. It might seem like speculative fiction, but we are living this reality. We are hurtling forward into the most glorious future. And I can't wait to meet you all there in the free. I mean, this is all I want to do.
Yeah.
I know that's hard to follow. That's hard to follow. Is there anything I haven't asked? Anything you would like to ask each other? Anything you would like to ask me? Anything you want to share with us that you haven't had a chance to?
I just want to say miigwech, chi miigwech. I know not to end this, but just to be so grateful to have an opportunity to be with you all and to be in right relationship and to be learning from you and to sit with your passion, Sai, because every time you talk, I'm like, whoa, it's so hopeful. I can't wait. Because there's been lots of times in my life where I haven't been able to see that or feel it for myself. So when I hear you say it, I can hold on. And I'm always so grateful for that. So I'm just so, just so grateful for an opportunity to have been part of the conversation within the book, within each of these moments with each of you. So miigwech.
Thank you.
Yeah, miigwech, chi miigwech. It was just an absolute honor to be a part of this conversation with all of you and to share our work and to be inspired by Cyrus and everything that everyone shared. And, you know, it's really hard to stay hopeful, you know, and it really does mean a lot to shift and manifest our energies in ways that are hopeful, because that they want to try to take that from us, you know, and we have to protect ourselves, and that means celebrating ourselves and being hopeful and being joyful that things can slowly move and shift, even if it's between each other and our own personal relationships with one another. So chi miigwech, hi for everyone and their words tonight.
Well, I started by reading the end of the book. And so I'm gonna end book club by reading the final paragraph on page 317. The final section is a sort of summary of what the book has addressed. And it ends by saying, finally, we consider the future through the past and present. Yes, we have not yet lived a liberated Blackness, but we are well on our way to creating that future. This compendium is a documentation of generative from the ground work that is Black affirming, Black loving. Work that is global, intergenerational, anti-capitalist, and trans-feminist in nature. We may not know exactly what its final form is, but we've imagined bits and pieces of it. We've felt the edges of it and even tasted it. We know what it doesn't look like, and we know what it will feel like. And we know that we will create it in the palimpsest. In the blackest of knowledge, we know we will win. Thank you to Black Lives Matter Toronto for this invitation to host this series. Thanks especially to Cyrus and Rodney for technical support, to Raven for leading us through performance, for Sandy and Janaea for joining me and supporting these conversations. Thank you to Leanne, Raven, Lily, and Giselle for helping me close this beautiful project out. Thank you for your thoughtful contributions, vulnerability, particularly sharing work in progress. I know as artists, that's not easy. This has been a joy and an honor. And thank you in the end to all of you who have joined me here for the last 4 weeks to give me your time and to listen to what folks have had to say and to read along. I really appreciate it.
Michelle, we just wanted to say thank you so much for the care and the love and the generosity that you've brought to this project. I couldn't have imagined another person leading us through this journey. And it has been such a joy. Every Tuesday, I'm like, yes, it's book club, you know, and whether I'm moving or dancing with Raven and Rodney or if I'm listening to, Janaea, tell me something that makes me feel like I'm living in the future already, or listening to all of you, Leanne, to get a chance to be able to meet you on this panel after reading your words. Like, just the way that you brought us together, Michelle, has been so powerful. And I really feel like you've opened the door of possibility for a lot of people, who are new to these ideas, just through the way that you have approached this. So thank you so much for your care and love. And I think you've really modeled how we're going to take care of each other in the future, just through the care that you brought to this project. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just also wanted to thank the editors of the book, Sandy and Rodney and Cyrus, because this is a really, really beautiful, beautiful gift. That it's seeds and it's a garden, and I think that it's just a tremendous book filled with Black radical brilliance. And yeah, so thank you to the editors, and thank you to Black Lives Matter Toronto for holding this space for us tonight. And thanks to Michelle, you did a great job.
I just remember, Giselle, would you like to sing or not? Don't want to put you on the spot, but you're on mute. I can't hear you're on mute.
Yes, I kind of hoped people would forget. Not.
No problem. I just realized I didn't want to,
Nope.
just in case you were ready and then I didn't give you the space, so.
Does anybody else know the song?
What song is it? Strong Women's
It's called The Longest Road.
Okay.
The Longest Walk, sorry.
No.
Anybody?
No, but
I
You know
might.
what? All right, let me do it.
Oh, wow,
Be
okay.
brave.
Woohoo.
yes.
So again, it's called The Longest Walk. It was a song that was taught to me by Marianne Cabiosi, an Anishinaabe elder friend. And it's about the solidarity of Black and Indigenous people together. So my drum's not warm, so it's gonna sound really hollow. Away, high, away, away, ah, hey, oh. Away, high, away, away, ah, hey, oh. Away, high, away, away, yeah, hey, oh. Way high, away, away, yeah, hey, oh. Away high, away, away, yeah, hey, oh. Away high, away, away, yeah, hey, oh. Away high, away, away, ah, hey, oh. Away high, away, away, ah, hey, oh. Away high, away, away, yeah, 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 hey, oh.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. That is a perfect way to end. To the long walk. May we all continue side by side. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.